Hello. Hi. So, welcome to our last visiting readers reading. I can't call it Lone Mountain because Doug corrected me last time, so here's the series. This is our last one for the year. Hi everybody, welcome. I'm so glad you could make it. This microphone is very tough. So just a few announcements before we get going. We have our graduation reading. And for those of you who are reading in the graduation reading, congratulations for making it this far and for taking 2.5 years out of your life and possibly a bunch of money to read 5 minutes of it. We all really look forward to this 5 minutes. I think it's going to be amazing. And for those of you who are not reading, please come because you get to see what an amazing 5 minutes looks like from your colleagues. So that is on December 11th. Thank you. Okay. And I think that's it for announcements. Otherwise, for those of you graduating, congratulations. And for those of you coming back in the spring, congratulations. And I would just like to take a minute to thank Micah and Kimberly for orchestrating this affair, though they are not here, so we will thank them in spirit. We have microphone and lights and coffee and beer and wine because of them. And then I want to introduce Tammy and say a few things also about our guest writer. So when I first read Jamel's book, I had a very familiar sensation of jealousy because the stories were just so perfect, and they also looked like they were easy to write, which I'm sure is not because all of us are here in the MFA program to understand process, and what comes out of many, many, many years of process is something that looks easy when actually you processed your way through it. There is an elegance and a potency and an urgency in the stories that I think will last a long time after all of us in this room are involved with MFA programs. And I'm really, really glad and honored that you can be here tonight to read to us and speak to us. I'm also very glad that Tammy Lee is going to be able to introduce Jamel because from what I hear, she is a fan and a graduating student. And everybody welcome Tammy Lee.
Well, I was going to say a couple introductory remarks, but after Lolly just took the words out of my mouth, I guess I'll just go right into Jamel's introduction. My name is Tammy, and I'm a third-year fiction student here in the MFA program. And it is with great pleasure that I will be introducing our guest of honor for tonight, Jamel Brinkley. I actually first met Jamel at a writing conference that took place this past summer, and he was one of the first faculty members to read, and I remember sitting there in the audience, and I was really struck by how powerful his reading was. And he talked about a topic that I myself had gone through. I just didn't know how to put the words into describing it, and he did so very beautifully, I might add. Later that night, I went back to my room, and I told myself something that came as a mark of being touched to the core from one artist to another. I said, I want to learn how to write like that. The next morning, I ran into Jamel at the prison station, and I think I blurted something out along the lines of like, I couldn't stop thinking about your reading last night. And as a result, he graciously let me use the computer before him. I'm mentioning this because what I said to him then is still the truth now. Jamel's work and his debut short story collection, A Lucky Man, will make you think about his pieces long into the night after you're finished reading them. In the 9 stories of A Lucky Man, you will remember his protagonists, Black boys, teenagers, men, and what they must confront as they navigate through life in Brooklyn and the South Bronx. You will remember two brothers who are forced to face each other and their past at a capoeira conference, or a teenager and his child brother as they get swept up in the confusion and celebration of an all-night festival. In my personal favorite story, Wolf and Rhonda, you will encounter two high school classmates who unexpectedly meet years later and decide to go to the last place they remember each other. With all of these characters, you will learn of their vulnerabilities, their loneliness, desires, and relationships that shape them into the people they are. For those of you here tonight who have not yet had the opportunity to read his work, I'd like to say two things. First, you will learn that Jamel's prose is brilliant. He covers so much depth while being subtle and quiet at the same time. And his descriptions of characters and settings are just so extremely vivid that there were moments where I myself had to stop and put down the book and let everything I just read sink in before I could turn the next page. And if you're the type of reader who has to highlight or mark a beautiful sentence or phrase, I will give you a fair warning ahead of time. You're gonna have to go back to your local Target and pick up another pack of tabs for a week. It just wasn't enough. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, a Carol Hawksmith Fiction Fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing, a National Book Award finalist, a Ernest J. Gaines, winner of the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence, and currently a Wallace Stegner Fellow in Fiction at Stanford University, among many other incredible accomplishments. Tonight's author is one you will spend the rest of this night and much longer thinking about. Please give me join me in giving a warm USL welcome. Not me. Please give Jamel a warm USL.
Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Good, cool. Thank you, Tammy, for that introduction. Thank you, Lali. I also want to say thank you to the rest of the creative writing faculty here at USF, and in particular to Doug Powell, who extended the invitation. And thank you all, of course, for being here. So when I was thinking about what to read tonight, one thing I thought about was that yesterday was my little brother's birthday. Calling him little brother, he's bigger than I am now. But I was thinking about him, and I was thinking about how brotherhood, in the biological sense, but also in the colloquial sense, were things that were on my mind when I was writing this book. So I thought I would read parts of two different stories that deal with brothers. Given that yesterday was my brother's birthday, he's a Scorpio. I'm also a Scorpio. So I think there's a little bit of Scorpio energy in these stories too that I think you'll pick up on. The last thing I'll say before I start reading is that when the legendary Toni Morrison died in August this year, I started rereading a lot of her work and reading her interviews and watching her interviews. And there's one interview that I had never seen before where she says that in her work, her characters have to be pushed into a place where all the definitions they have of themselves become suspect, suspicious. And she says her characters have to be stripped down and made very lean so that you can see who they really are. And that really resonated with me, so I transcribed it. And I hope that you see some trace of that in what I want to share with you tonight. So the first brother piece I want to read from is called Everything the Mouth Eats. And like the second piece I'm going to read, it's narrated by an older brother. This is Everything the Mouth Eats. Carlos and I refer to each other as brothers, but technically we're half brothers. I was born to our mother in North Carolina, and he was born in New York. Our mother met the man who would become my stepfather, Carlos's father, in Brooklyn, when she was struggling and unhappy with her job at Montgomery Ward. He was a career counselor then, and in those days, though I find it hard to believe, he treated my mother with great kindness. She says he gave her sound advice, but more important, he took an interest in her beyond her employment, an interest that alleviated her loneliness. Soon enough, they were seeing each other, and then we were leaving Brooklyn for the Bronx to move in with him. My own father is a man I have no memory or evidence of. The first clear images I have of my stepfather are from the day we moved, when I was 4. He lived near the top of a housing project in the South Bronx, in the same apartment where he had grown up. I gawked at the sheer size and formidable brick of the building, and of the buildings that stood around it, throwing down enormous shadows everywhere. And so he too became impressive. He was an overweight, striking Puerto Rican man with large hands, light skin, and wide, active eyes. With his thick black horseshoe mustache, he was trying to approximate or even surpass Willie Colon, whose face would appear again and again if you flipped through the sleeves of his record collection. I was so impressed, which is to say frightened, by these buildings, by this man, by this new scale of being, that I peed my pants, just as we were about to board the elevator that would take us up to our new home. When it wasn't broken, that elevator took us to and from our home on the 10th floor for over 10 years. In the first of those years, my mother became pregnant with my brother. I don't remember anything about his birth or his first appearance in our apartment, but I do remember feeling vaguely indignant that I would no longer be an only child. I also remember that Carlos was a fussy baby, not allowing anyone but our mother to hold him, though later, with no effort or enthusiasm on my part, he suddenly warmed up to me. One of his first words, frequently yelled from his crib, was Badi, the nonsensical pet name he had invented for me. There was something antic and skittish about him, however, so I didn't feel whatever connection I was supposed to. Carlos's father had a game he liked to play, especially during the time our mother was taking evening classes in accounting, when we, the 2 boys, were alone with him. He began it as soon as Carlos could talk. He would take one of us onto his lap and say, "Who do you belong to?" We quickly learned that the correct answer was Daddy. But the speed of our learning was less important than the speed of our response, and we could never respond quickly enough. As soon as he asked a question, even if it seemed that the answer came right away, even if the answer interrupted the question, he would begin relentlessly tickling whichever boy was sitting on him. Countless times, his thick fingers would clamp onto my narrow rib cage, and no matter how many times I screamed the word Daddy, I would be left gasping and nearly crying. Carlos was also a subject of this regime of laughter and filial affection, yelling and thrashing until he slid from his father's lap and shared with me the mercy of finally making it down to the floor. Afterward, we would often be forced to massage his feet. He'd be on the couch and we would still be on the floor, each of us with a bare foot. I remember the sour smell, the hard skin on his sole and under his big toe. But we were only slightly menaced by this game. If he came home from work and sent us trembling to the floor, then it meant he was in a good mood. On such evenings, he might also play some of his pop records. With this music blasting out of the speakers, he would dance, his brow knitted, his bottom lip tucked into his mouth, spinning and sliding in his thin dress socks. I would join in mostly by jumping up and down. Carlos moved with more grace and sophistication. He understood his limbs and his hips, and he understood time. Even then, he was a skilled and intelligent dancer. At that point, Carlos's father was working as an officer with the Department of Probation. Once when my brother and I were out of school for some odd holiday, my stepfather took us to work with him for the first time. The building where he worked, in Lower Manhattan, down on Center Street, was imposing and severe, a place that supposedly handled matters of justice, but which nevertheless looked merely like a prison. The three of us went through a metal detector and rode an elevator to one of the highest floors. It was morning, but my brother and I were allowed to get potato chips, red licorice, and soda from the vending machines. As we made our way down the hall, Carlos's father had us peek into certain offices and cubicles so he could show us off to his coworkers. After we got to his office, a middle-aged white woman with a long neck and her hair in a tight bun came in to chat. She pointed to my brother and said, "Oh my God, is this your son?" "They both are," he said. "Well, this one looks just like you. The same smile, the wavy hair. Look at his adorable baby fat." "These are my boys," he said. "But this tall guy, he isn't your biological, right?" He looked at her then in that familiar way. His eyelids parted as far as they could go, the orbs themselves seeming to have moved a full inch out of their sockets. She appeared to be the sort of person who walked around the office saying things she shouldn't say. If he had had the proper authority, he might have fired her on the spot. Instead, he stood behind me and put a strong hand on each of my shoulders. "Yes, he is," he told her calmly. "They both are, like I said." Everyone in that room, except maybe Carlos, who was very young, though even he may have sensed it, knew this was a ridiculous statement. My stepfather's colleagues had to be at least somewhat familiar with the basic facts of his home life. Also, I looked nothing like him, and at the time I looked nothing like Carlos. His hair was curlier and softer, mine lighter by a few shades. Only later would a few similarities of nose and cheek from our mother become apparent. It was possible and less absurd that I had been grabbed off the corner of Center Street for the purpose of an office gag. The woman pinched her mouth shut and then went out the door, leaving us alone in the room with my stepfather's lie. "You are my son," he said, not gently. "You know that, right?" The look on his face wasn't very different from the one he had given the woman, and his voice was a double voice. I heard the unmistakable command in the lower one, so I nodded. He sat down in the chair next to his desk and made Carlos and me stand together before him. A distance from my brother opened suddenly, as if each of the years separating our births were a tract of desert now stretched between us. "Who do you belong to?" he asked us. There was no threat of tickling this time, which somehow made things worse. "Daddy," we said. In addition to taking evening classes, our mother had also started a day job, which meant that I had to walk Carlos to and from our nearby school and babysit him until an adult got home. In those unsupervised hours after school, we never had much to say to each other. We played, however, and I began to play rough with him. Back then, we watched professional wrestling on television, and it was easy to persuade him to let me try out the moves. When we played this way, I always took on the role of the villain, the heel. I'd pick him up and slam his body onto our dingy couch, bend his spine against my knee, apply various choke holds, pretend to smash his head into the wall. We both knew that pro wrestling was fake, at times barely on the threshold of convincing physicality, and we played in the same spirit. This usually extinguished the aggression that flared within me. But one day when I was in 8th grade and Carlos was in 3rd, we wrestled for a long time, until I had him in a chokehold called the sleeper. I was behind him with one arm wrapped around his neck and the other cradling the side of his head. This was routine for us. I would pretend to squeeze his windpipe, and he would pretend to gasp for breath, swinging his arms stiffly in the air until he feigned unconsciousness. But this time, all I saw in my mind was my biceps. Carlos flailed as I kept flexing, and I was fascinated by the way a part of my body could be hardened into stone. Even when his weight sagged against me and he stopped flailing, I kept on with the routine, now acting as the referee. I let him slump against the front of the couch, then lifted his arm by the wrist and let it drop. I lifted it again, and it dropped, and he fell onto his side. If his arm dropped a 3rd time, it would mean I had put him to sleep and I had won the match. But I never won this way. Carlos had never let his arm drop a 3rd time. He would hold it in the air to signal consciousness, and his eyes would pop open. And then he would go on the attack. That afternoon, however, his arm did drop a 3rd time. I raised my fist in victory and stomped around the living room, jeering at the imaginary crowd that surrounded us as my brother lay on the floor. Full of an uncaged power, I laughed and pointed at him to show the crowd how weak their hero was. I planted my foot on his hip and raised my fists again. But when he didn't move, I began to get scared. His fingers were curled like shriveled leaves, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. I nudged him with my foot. Was he breathing? I squatted beside his heaped body and began to shake him. Tears ran down to my nostrils and my jaw. "Carlos, I'm sorry. Please wake up," I kept saying. "Carlos, wake up. I'm sorry. Please wake up. I'm so sorry." When he finally woke up, his squinting eyes blinked with confusion. Maybe it was because he realized what had happened, or because he saw my tears, but he started crying too. He held his arms out toward me, but I backed away, afraid. In this moment, how could either of us think touch was a good thing? I wiped my cheeks. "Why didn't you breathe?" I said. "You're not supposed to stop breathing. Why didn't you say something?" He kept nodding, accepting the blame as he cried. "But you can't tell," I said. "Carlos, you can't tell what happened. We'll get in trouble. We both will. You can't tell." Carlos never did tell on me. He was convinced that I had saved us from a beating, and he maybe even thought I had saved his life. In gratitude, he built a little religion and installed me as its godhead. This went beyond a younger sibling's normal admiration for his elder. In a way, I had once again become Badi, the alpha of his first and most private language. He was so single-minded in his devotion that thereafter, when his father tickled him and asked, "Who do you belong to?" it was a shock that he didn't respond by naming me. Okay, so that's that piece. The second piece I want to read, second and last piece I want to read, is from a story called Juve, 1996, also narrated by an older brother. Tonally different, I think. So, you know, this is Juve, 1996, the very beginning of the story. I'm just going to read the first part. All I wanted was $15 to go to the barber shop. But the thought of asking for it made me feel like punching a wall. It stressed me the hell out to ask Ma for anything, especially that summer when I decided to leave my boyhood behind. Pop would have known just what to say, to calm me down or make me laugh. He wasn't around anymore though, and he had stopped responding to my letters. So I went to our room to gather myself and practice my appeal. But of course my little brother was there, too bizarre to ignore. Omari still had on his stupid rubber mask, a caricature of a great horned owl. A candy cigarette poked out at an angle from under its mottled beak. He was sitting at our desk, his butt swallowing the chair, and the clock radio played that boring white people music he liked. The oscillating fan rattled as it blew his newspaper clippings across the floor. Our room was strewn with these sheets of taped together headlines. As he paged through a neighbor's discarded daily news, a few caught my eye. And these are real headlines, by the way. Homeless youth under house arrest. Death named country's top killer. One armed boy applauds kindness of strangers. Together, these formed a patchwork calendar of the world's absurdity. A pathetic cloud of chalky smoke made of powdered sugar fell from the tip of Omari's cigarette. He had found something he liked, a small but representative peculiarity. After testing his scissors on the air, he slowly snipped out a headline, making a show of it. "September's the weirdest month," he said. The cigarette bobbed up and down under the beak as he spoke. "September just started, dummy," as I said. "I can already tell." He rose and stretched. At 11, he was nearly as tall as I was and broad like Pop, his body an unchiseled slab. The ear tufts of his mask were sharp enough to scratch you. He squeezed between the fan and our bunk bed and went to the window. Though the kitchen was on the other side of the apartment, we could hear sink water speeding through the pipes. We lived on the second floor of our building, not even high enough to see the top of the tree outside. Leaves from a bough pressed against the window. In a month, the view would be pretty. The panes tessellated in autumn shades, but it wasn't so nice now. When I was younger, right when Pop stopped coming around, I had nightmares about that tree breaking through the glass and reaching inside to grab me with its branches. "I invited somebody over today," Omari sang. He gestured toward the window frame. Apparently, his newest imaginary friend was there. "Her name's Angela," he said. "Who cares?" I said. Omari turned his face toward me, twisting his neck as far as it would go. He unwrapped the paper from the cigarette and bent the hard gum until it broke. Reaching under the beak which curved from the bridge of his nose, he slipped the pieces into his mouth. The black and amber eyes of his mask were large and round, but the freaky thing was Omari's eyes within those eyes. They stared directly at me now, like 2 pennies sunk in a bucket. Where we lived, it didn't matter what a room was called. Ma would wash her hair in the kitchen, careful when she was done rinsing not to hit her head on the bottom of the cabinet. Sometimes she'd take phone calls in the bathroom or go in there to listen to the radio. When she was sick of me fighting with Omari, she'd take her dinner plate into her bedroom and go out to eat in peace on the fire escape. Now she was in the kitchen, actually washing dishes. She used scalding hot water and never wore rubber gloves. Her hands were tough, long, and deeply lined. She was tough, with wiry, muscular arms. But this afternoon, as she cleaned, she also concealed the woman I knew by making herself look soft. Pink plastic rollers filled her hair. The smell of dabbed-on Florida water rose from her skin. Mike, her new boyfriend, was coming over. Our dish rack rested on top of the refrigerator. There was no other place for it, and she handed me clean plates to stack there as I made my case. She leaned against the wall, seemingly exhausted, her long slip spotted with spray from the faucet. "Money's tight," she said. "You know that, Ty. I told you to get a job this summer, but you hard-headed. A lazy boy does things twice." She shoved a fistful of wet utensils at my chest, but I just looked at them. I wanted to get my haircut at the place Pop used to go. I was 17 and had never been to a barbershop. Homegrown afros and cornrows all my life. Maybe I wouldn't know what to say once I got there. Maybe I'd ask for the wrong thing or laugh at the wrong time, surrounded by all those clever men grooming each other's masculinity. Still, even if I embarrassed myself, I felt ready. I was almost a grown-up, not a boy. Plus, tomorrow was the West Indian Day parade, and this was the first time she was letting me go by myself. "If you're not going to help," she said now, "get out of the way and quit breathing all over me." Now we both stared at the forks and knives clutched in her hand. "Ma," I told her, "I need to look good." She shut off the water, jammed the utensils in the rack, and sidestepped by me. "Been doing this boy's hair all his life," she muttered. "I'll just cut it my damn self." She started banging around in the closet where we kept photo albums, boxes of discount toilet paper, and Pops' old winter coats. Next thing I knew, I was sitting in the living room with my shoulders draped in a towel. Here was the woman I knew, a force of nature, and I was totally helpless against her. Maybe some invisible force would steady Ma's hand, but who was I kidding? I had probably just stumbled again into that stagnant puddle of mud. Belief. It was silly to think good things could possibly happen, but I had no choice. So I described the style I wanted, picturing it as I spoke. A skin fade like the one Pops had, with the taper smooth and balanced, perfectly even all the way around. A timeless look. But Ma wasn't even listening. She fumbled with the box, which had a white person cheesing on the front, proud of its bowl cut. "Are you sure you don't want one of those high tops?" She hovered a hand several inches above her head. "That looks easy enough to do." I began to fidget in the chair and made one more attempt. "All the guys from school go to the barber shop," I told her. "Trip's been going since before he could walk." "Like I give a damn about some fool calls himself Trip," Ma said. "Trip? Trip ain't in this family. Trip ain't got to make the sacrifices we do." "Sacrifices? That's right," she said, "for your brother and for you too." "Don't you mean Mike?" The heat rose quickly on my ear after she hit me, my cheek stinging from her still moist hand. Though she yelled plenty at me, almost never at Omari, Ma rarely hit. Before she could scold me or hit me again, the intercom rang. She made her voice all sweet to call Omari and tell him to buzz Mike up. Then she started on my hair. Soon Mike walked in with a bottle of bright pink wine and his dopey grin. Ma got dopey in response and apologized for her appearance. "Always look good to me, babe," Mike said. He kissed her on the cheek and plopped down on the couch, the coffee table sandwiched tightly between us. Omari sat too, exactly where Pop used to relax with a beer and watch TV. "You keep nicking me," I said. Ma was being rough with the clippers. "Well, stop talking. Your whole head moves when you talk." "I'm not the retard here." What did I tell you about saying retard? Mike grinned extra big as he took in the show. "Ruth," he said, "you are truly a woman of many talents." Ma nicked me again when she laughed, and the clippers barked at every botched contact with my scalp. When she stood apart to take in her progress, they hummed in her hand. Mike said, "Boy, looked like he could be on TV. Right, Birdman?" Omari's eyes shifted within the owls. He was smiling. Though shy around Mike, he didn't seem to mind him. This pissed me off, even though he was too young to remember when there had been a real man around. When Mike offered to add some finishing touches himself, I hopped up immediately and hair rained from my shoulders. I rushed to the mirror by the front door and I couldn't believe what I saw. On top, a tall, crumbling brick of hair, edged by a jagged line, a sharp, wandering border. There was no fade, no taper at all. I've had this haircut, by the way. My mouth got tight, ready to curse loud and long, but Ma gave me a look that stopped me in my tracks. She said she wanted me to take Omari out for a while. "For what?" I said. "Because of him?" Mike spread his arms, a gesture that meant, "Don't you dare talk to your mother that way," at the same time as it said, "Hey kid, just leave me the hell out of it." "You got a problem with that tie?" Ma said. "I'm not the one bringing in problems," I said. "Do you pay the rent here?" she said. "Do you pay any of the bills? I'm a grown woman and I work my ass off. I'll be damned if I can't have a friend over." Omari sang, "Everybody needs to have a friend." I told him to shut up. "I need to take another shower," Ma said wearily. "By the time I'm done, I want you boys out enjoying the day." "Well, can we at least get some money?" I asked. Ma went to the window and switched on the hulking air conditioner we rarely used. "Be back in time to set the dinner table. 6 o'clock sharp. You'll be all right till then." When she shut herself in the bathroom, Mike flipped something at me. A quarter. "In case you think about coming back early," he said, eyeing his bottle of wine, "go on and give us a call first." This is 1996. Okay, just a few more paragraphs. Outside, it was a hot, breezeless day, the air gauzy and wet. Though the sun was high in the sky, a lone and distant object, the energy of it came from everywhere at once. I wandered around the neighborhood, tugging down the bill of my Knicks cap. Omari trailed behind. Families walked from afternoon church service, sweating in their dress clothes. Fathers unbuttoned dark jackets from their paunches and slid down the knots of ties. One man with a bushy soul patch under his lip shouted for his little girl to stop running as she neared a corner. The weather was similar when I had gone to the West Indian Day parade with Pop. This was before he went away, when I was 7 and Omari was a baby. I heard Pop come in early Labor Day morning and get ambushed. Ma was yelling because he had stayed out all night. They argued like crazy and woke Omari. Then Pop came into my room bleary-eyed and told me to get ready. When we left, Ma was still screaming and Omari was crying in her arms. The parade was heat and laughter, flags and flutes, music so loud I felt it was shaking me more and more awake. I had my first taste of jerk pork there. I even got to pick the exact pieces I wanted from the vendor's smoking grill. After we ate, Pop lifted me to see over the crowd on Eastern Parkway. The women dancing in the procession were nearly naked, but plumed, with sprays of brilliant multicolored feathers. When I shifted my eyes away from their bodies, Pop laughed and told me it was okay to look. Mike's quarter felt warm and dirty in my shorts pocket now. I was tempted to pitch it into a gutter. Omari lagged behind me, walking with one foot on the sidewalk and the other in the street. I was melting in my cap, and here he was with that mask. He'd been wearing it since Mike began coming around. All of a sudden, Maud started acting girlish, humiliating herself. She even smiled in a ridiculous way, like she did in her pictures from high school. You could see all her teeth, and held like a tiny bud between them the bright red tip of her tongue. She crossed and uncrossed her legs with extreme awareness of herself, awareness that Mike enjoyed looking at her, delighted that he did, as if she were some other woman and not our mother. The first time she sent us away from the apartment in June, Mike wasn't gone by the time she had told us to come back. They were in her room. We could hear the muffled sounds of an old, corny love song, plus other sounds. I knew what they were doing. I rushed Omari into our room and slammed the door. Not that it did much good. We could still hear them. I went on a rampage. I yanked the sheets from our beds, knocked toys from Omari's shelves, tore his drawings and posters from the walls, and even ripped up some of his headlines. When I came out of it, he was curled up in a corner, rubbing the sides of his face. He stared at me like he didn't know who I was. After Mike finally left, sneaking out like a thief, Ma seemed embarrassed. She apologized, but only for dinner being late. She made us something extra nice, but it didn't matter. Before the end of that night, Omari was already hiding his face in the mask. I'll stop there. Thank you. Cool. Thanks again so much for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions. Hi.
Hey there. Thanks for reading. I noticed in the first piece you were vacillating back and forth between my stepfather and then Carlos's father. Could you talk a little bit about the intentionality behind that?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think as the narrator is telling this story, that switch between identifying that man is indicative of the drama that he's feeling as a kid, you know. That game that they play is the father is making a claim on them. And when he takes them to work, he's also making a claim on both of them in the same way. And my sense is that the father meant it to be a gesture that the narrator would welcome, but the narrator receives it differently. And so I think, you know, switching between my stepfather and Carlos's father is kind of like pushing him away and drawing him close. He doesn't know his own biological father. So I think there's a part of him that wants this man to be his father, but then there's a part of him that feels, you can never be my father. And so switching back and forth, I think, is one way of indexing that, of sort of showing this push-pull, this attraction-repulsion that he has to this guy. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah. Hmm?
So to follow that, that's something that would come up in workshop. People being like, why are you calling this person this thing and whatnot? Why are you calling this person this other thing?
Yeah.
How did you get the confidence or the, sort of directionality to be like, no, it's going to be this kind of slightly messy way
Yeah.
to represent the messy truth?
Yeah, that's true. That kind of thing would come up in a workshop, and it may have even come up in the workshop when I submitted an early draft of that story. But I think when we're writing in workshop, when we're reading, I think it's important to pay attention to the difference between just an inconsistency versus a character being consistently inconsistent. And I think that inconsistency is okay in this instance, or I hope it is, because it's characterizing of the narrator and of his relationship with the stepfather. And I think that's what you have to do. Like, we have to resist the impulse to sort of, stamp rules on a piece and kind of see what each individual story or novel chapter or whatever it is demanding. And if it demands a kind of messiness that is sort of an external sign of the character's internal messiness, then I think you can get away with it. Or I hope so. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. How do you create different layers in the characters' relationships? I'm thinking about I Happy Am with Freddie and Mrs. Clinkstill's relationship and what's going on in that story and in that dialogue. How do you create those layers to create complexity?
Yeah. Can you say more about what you were thinking with I Happy Am?
Mrs. Clinkstill and Freddie.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think one thing that really helps is that, so anytime you write a story and you choose your main character, your protagonist, your point of view character, the character that the story is focalized through, I think that you're kind of pledging allegiance to that character in a way, which is important. But I'm also suspicious of all pledges of allegiance. So I think in a story, what you also have to do is to remember that every other character is sort of the star of their own lives, right? And instead of making, sort of in that story, instead of Mrs. Clinkstill being just a satellite in Freddie's life, she's got her own concerns, right? She's got her own designs, her own desires, her own sadness, her own source of joy. And the way I think you start getting that complexity is when two characters who are each the stars of their own lives come together, and you don't allow one to bend to the other so easily. You let them have their own gravity, right? Like if you watch basketball, right? There's this concept of gravity. Steph Curry has a lot of gravity, right? On the court, meaning he draws a lot of attention. That's great for basketball, right? But in a story, I think you want everyone to be Steph Curry. You want everyone to have their own gravity. And if everyone has their own gravity, then no one is going to simplify themselves for the benefit of another character. And everyone keeps their own innate complexity. Does that make sense? Yeah. Hi.
Hey, so has your brother read your work and
Yeah.
you guys talked about it?
Yeah, he's read it. And I don't know, I think we haven't really talked specifically about the plots of the stories, because the plots of the stories are made up. But we have talked about, for us, what it meant to be brothers and what it felt like growing up. And it's fascinating because, and all of you who have siblings know this, you grow up, if you grew up together, you have so many of the same experiences. But your memory of those experiences, the way you narrate those experiences, and how those experiences have affected you can be completely different. And that kind of rupture, that sort of gap is really interesting to me. And so we talked about stuff like that, you know, like, remember this time? I'm like, yeah, but I didn't remember it that way. And, you know, I try not to think about that because of this. And I'll be like, well, that was a great day for me. And he was like, well, that was a terrible day for me. And that kind of thing is fascinating to me. And so, you know, he has read my collection. He's read those stories. And, you know, like when I'm thinking about, I mentioned that Toni Morrison quote earlier. And I think I grew up thinking I was a good brother. That was my definition of myself. And I realize now the ways in which I wasn't, you know, not always. And in a story, you can kind of get to that kind of thing, right? You can get to someone sensing themselves, I'm a good brother, or I'm a man. I'm 17, I'm a man, right? But the story's gonna be like, oh yeah, you're a good brother? Okay, let's see, right? And puts that pressure on you. You're a man, you're a good brother? I don't know, let's put that to the test. And a story can make those things really rise up in a stark way, a conspicuous way. But yeah, we have talked about it. We have talked about it. And it's funny how many of the memories that we share are just so different. So different. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. How long did you work on this collection, and were there ever any stories that you were thinking may be a part of it, or was it always this one eye?
Yeah, you know, so the oldest story in the collection, I started drafting maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And the bulk of them were written while I was at my MFA program between 2013 and 2015. Then I spent 2 years revising all of them. Over those years, there were probably 5 or 6 other stories I wrote that did not make it into the collection for a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, I never thought of myself as writing a collection until someone told me I was. I was just writing stories, and I was trying to, you know, I had tunnel vision with each of them. And I never started, you know, the buzzword for my book was masculinity. And, you know, I've had questions, people are like, so, how did you know you wanted to write a book about masculinity? I was like, I didn't know I was doing that. But of course I was, you know, hopefully it's about other things too, but I never started off a story saying, this is the theme. I'm writing towards this theme. I just wrote stories, and I wrote like 15 of them, and 9 of them, these 9, spoke to each other in a way that the other 5 or 6 did not. And it was interesting to see that, because again, I wasn't consciously trying to get stories to fit together in that way. But of course, your mind is bigger than your conscious mind, right? And there were threads that went throughout these stories. Yeah. I
was kind of curious about your use of perspective in these stories. Both of these seem to be very reflective. They're coming from a perspective many years later. And I've read one other story, that the first one in this collection, that follows a similar pattern.
Yep.
I was wondering if you could talk about, is that a particularly striking or impactful or useful perspective for you in your work, do you find?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, but maybe not in the way that you might think. Yeah, I do use retrospection in a few of my first person stories, like explicitly retrospective, someone looking back, and you know it by the tone, or, you know, it's explicitly stated in the story. And often we think of retrospection as like the place of, I am older and wiser and more clear-headed, and I can look back on this time when I was younger and more flawed and more foolhardy. And there is that aspect to it. But I also think I also think that the place of retrospection is also a place of confusion. You know, like I look back on stuff and it doesn't mean like, I understand now. You know, I just, like, even more questions are conjured up. And so sometimes you look back on something because you understand it now. I think sometimes you look back on stuff because you're still trying to figure it out. And I think that that kind of buzz of confusion, that kind of that sort of soup of like, you know, I don't know what that was. Like, why did that happen? I think I want that energy more than like the clear-sighted energy in my stories. That you look back on the mystery of your former self. Like, that's really interesting to me. And that you can't always puzzle it out. You can't always explain it. It's just something that happened and it haunts you, you know? And that haunting is, you know, it's felt really acutely, like on the skin, you know? I kind of want that feeling more than, now I am old and wise, you know, and I know why I was a terrible child, you know? Does that make sense? Yeah. Hi.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the tone between the two stories.
Yeah.
There was one that had a lot more of this kind of lighter comedic feel to it, but it was still this kind of tragic situation. And I was just wondering, I think that's something that I struggle with finding, you know, you can have funny dialogue, or you can have funny lines, but how do you have that mood throughout a piece, and kind of how do you approach writing something in that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it might be, for me, especially in that story, it might be the difference between the voice of the narrator and the voices of the characters speaking in dialogue. So I think the overall tone of the narrator, you know, Ty telling the story, has that kind of sad or tragic feel to it. But it's often what the characters are saying in dialogue that provides the humor. And, you know, I was just thinking about humor because, you know, I'm in a workshop now at Stanford, and we workshopped 2 pieces yesterday that were both really funny. So it just got me thinking about humor because I don't think I'm that funny of a writer. And so, you know, I'm just reading all this stuff. Like I was reading Lori Moore and reading George Saunders, and you know, Lori Moore talks a lot about awkwardness as being the source of humor, but then awkwardness sort of turning into melancholy, turning into like the tragic, basically, that kind of movement. And George Saunders talks about humor as like the truth of something is delivered more quickly than you expect it to be. And so those are some ways I think that you can access humor, often in what people say, just in their voice, while also keeping a different kind of tone in the narration, if that makes sense. You can keep them side by side. And I think there's a benefit to having both, because I think they play off of each other well. Like you feel if there is a tragic tone, then I think the comedy makes you feel that more. And vice versa. I think that a tragic tone, those bolts of comedy will jump out at you even more. So working by contrast, I think, is a nice way to think about tones. Yeah, getting a range of tones into your work. Yeah. Yeah.
You just mentioned voice, and I guess my question kind of ties into that, especially in the passage about wrestling with
Yeah.
your brother. You are able to walk like this tightrope of having the child's voice enough to make us feel, you know, turning to the imaginary audience that you have, and then adult enough that you can bring in a concept like a godhead.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, when you're approaching, you know, especially a retrospective like that, how you identify and craft a voice within a balance to kind of approach multiple subjects like that at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why I like having explicit retrospection as an option in a piece, because with explicit retrospection, you open up this distance, and in that distance is like a more sophisticated vocabulary, all that kind of stuff. But then you can also close the distance whenever you want. It's like an accordion, right? So when you need Godhead, when you need tessellated, right, you can sort of open up and expand out and remind the reader, oh, this is being told by an adult. but sometimes the demands of the story require you to sink back into the person you were back then. You can't give yourself the safety of distance anymore, right? So it couldn't be like, I feel bad now that I choked my brother. You know, it has to be, no, you have to, part of the pain of telling the story is that you have to really become the person who did that terrible thing again. You know, you have to go through the grain of that experience, right? You have to lift your brother's hand and watch it drop. You have to watch him slump over. You have to put your foot on his body and raise your hands and pay attention to a crowd that's not there while your brother is unconscious, right? You have to do that again, right? Or else you're not really reckoning with the experience, right? So it's a way for me to have it both ways. I don't know if it's cheating. If it is, I don't care. But I like artistically, I like all the different tools that it gives me and the flexibility that it gives me. Yeah. Yeah.
So the poem's about your family, because when I write poetry about my family,
Yeah.
I kind of have to be in a different physical space. I can't be anywhere near them.
Uh-huh.
Or just have anything that reminds me of them.
Uh-huh.
I have to be in a total different area. So could you kind of like describe the physical space that you're in when you write these deep poems about your family?
Well, first of all, thank you for calling them poems. Well, thank you. No, seriously, I'm like, cool, got my poetry badge. Yeah, I think there is, so I write at home. I live in Oakland. I wrote most of these stories in Iowa City, in an apartment I had there. I'm a home writer. Some of you might be like cafe writers or library writers. A strange species you are. I write at home because I need my own space. So in a way, I feel what you're saying. Like I need my desk. I need my coffee mug. I need my footy pajamas. And I can't write, you know, in proximity to a lot of other people usually. And you know, even though these stories aren't necessarily about my actual family, there are traces in there, like little elements. And I don't know if I could have written them living with them. I think, you know, again, I was talking earlier about that retrospective distance. There is something to that distance. You know, whether it's distance from your family, distance from a place you want to write about. You know, like James Baldwin famously talked about how he couldn't write about America until he left America. You know, so I think there's something to it. Like when you're not under assault, so to speak. You know, you're not sort of in the thick of it. Maybe you can gain enough perspective, not 100% perspective. I don't know if that's possible, but maybe you can gain enough perspective to write something that is ordered and has a shape, you know? So yeah, but I would say, you know, whatever works for you. And if you know that about, you know, what you need in order to write about your family or any other particular subject, then plan accordingly. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Does a lot of your work derive from family?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the sources vary. You know, so like with the stories that I read, like I've never rendered my brother unconscious. Or, you know, my brother never wore a mask. So I'm not pulling from actual things that happened in my family. I'm more pulling from feeling, maybe, like the feeling of having a brother. The feeling of, you know, there being this other person there that you have authority over in some ways, right? the feeling of granting attention or neglecting and having the ability to do that. You know what I mean? So that kind of thing I think that I pulled from. But otherwise, you know, the sources of my fiction vary. You know, it could be a particular place. So I have a story about a bar that is located in a gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn. And that was based on a bar located in a gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn. But it wasn't the bar in my story. Like, you know, I sort of made up the bar in the story, but I knew that I kind of wanted to write about this kind of place that had a long-standing history and was kind of like a center of community there. And then all of a sudden, the community's not there anymore. So what happens to a place like that? So it was that kind of question, really. So ultimately, I guess what I want to say is I'm writing based on questions that I have about a kind of experience, a kind of memory, a kind of place, a kind of observation that I've made. I mean, and it's the questions more than anything else that let me know that a story is possible. Yeah. Hi, Doug.
I was reading something actually last night that Ethan Keenan said about story writing, that you have to choose a central consciousness that you like. And of course, immediately I thought, there must be stories where people don't like the character that they're writing from or the perspective that they're writing from.
Yeah.
Has that happened? I mean, now I'm testing my theory by
Yeah. I have been in a room with Ethan Keenan where this very thing came up and people argued with him. And I think I was one of the people arguing with him. I think to me, I mean, I get what he's saying because I've tried. I think maybe because he said that, I tried to write a story from like a really despicable consciousness, and it was actually difficult. So I think he does have a point, but I think that the more important thing is just the character's interesting somehow. You know, even if they're amoral, immoral, unlikable in some way, but you find them interesting. You find the way that they move through the world interesting. Like, you know, even from what I read, like, I don't know if I like the wrestling brother in that moment, but I think the way that he's thinking in that moment is interesting to me, that he just had this experience with his half-brother, right? And I'm sure he's thinking of him as his half-brother in that moment, where his half-brother's biological father is laying an equal claim on both of them, but he feels embarrassed because of that, because he thinks it's a lie, and it's an obvious lie. And so, I'm gonna take that out on you, right? I don't like him in that moment, but that kind of thinking is interesting to me. And I'm sure that there are limits. Like, if he had killed his brother, I probably, you know, maybe wouldn't want to go there. But there's something about that way of thinking that's fascinating to me. But I don't admire it. Yeah. So I think you're right. I agree with you. Yeah. Oh, hey. Yeah.
So one of the things I admire about your work and your body of work is the way that you tackle this notion of masculinity. I know that you said that's not something that you confront directly,
Yeah.
right? But it seems like a lot of your setting has to do with New York City.
Yeah.
Is that something that you think about when you sit down to write consciously? Like, do you start with setting and then
Yes.
branch out from there?
Yes.
Especially in a place like New York with millions of different stories from millions of different people.
Yeah. Your question is makes me think of a lot of different things. I mean, New York is probably the most overrepresented place in literature, right? So there's kind of like another New York book there. But I feel like I haven't, you know, like I'm not writing about, you know, people who like wealthy people in the Upper East Side. You know, I'm writing about neighborhoods. I'm writing about black people in the Bronx, black people in Brooklyn, in the same way that Edward P. Jones writes about black people in Washington, D.C. And so that was kind of my model. And what I love about Jones's work is that he knows, well, current D.C., who knows, but he knows that place. And you feel it. He's very particular with like street names and stuff like that. And so I kind of wanted to have a similar kind of devotion to place and to really think about how place in terms of the city, but also place in terms of like these particular apartments in these particular neighborhoods, in these particular streets affect character, you know? So, for example, when I was writing the first draft of the piece I just read, the last one, I kind of had it as an idea in my head that I wanted this to be like a really small, cramped New York apartment. But in my initial drafts, that the crampedness of the apartment was all adjectival. It was all in the adjectives. I just kept being like small, cramped, tiny. And it didn't do anything. You know, it didn't do anything to the characters. That's what I mean. And, you know, so when I don't remember, I think I did workshop an early version that was like that. And my teacher was like, yeah, it's not gonna do it, man. He was like, you gotta like, if you want Ty to be as agitated and driven and pressured to do what he does the rest of the story, it has to start in that apartment. So you can't just be like, it's cramped, it's small, it's tiny. You've got to show him like bodies rubbing as they go past each other. You've got to have, you know, thin walls where you're hearing what's going on in the other room. You've got to have no privacy in the drama of the story, right? Because those are the kinds of things that are going to chip away at Ty, right? Like that Toni Morrison quote, like make them lean, right? You're sort of stripping away at them. And it's that kind of thing that makes him do what he does the rest of the story, right? They don't come home for dinner at 6 o'clock, right? And so that's place too, right? So it's not just thinking like it's the Bronx, it's an apartment, it's small, but also place as active, right? Place acts on the characters. It has to be almost more real than the characters, right? Because it's shaping them. So yeah, that's super important to me. Yeah, exactly. Those utensils, right? They're in this little tiny kitchen, and she's got like forks and knives in her hand, you know. So that just the feeling of that, yeah, all of that was important. Yeah. Hi.
Can you give us any advice about post-MFA, post-MFA life, and then was anything about it that surprised you?
Yeah, advice. I mean, I guess I would begin by saying that I'm answering your question from a very privileged and fortunate place. Because I finished my MFA, I got a fellowship at Wisconsin, and I'm doing another post-MFA fellowship now. I guess it's not technically a post-MFA fellowship, but you know what I mean? So I have more institutional support. And if you can get that, that would be my first bit of advice. But you know, other than that, I think, you know, you hear this a lot. I remember hearing this a lot in MFA and kind of like dismissing it or not thinking much of it. But Samantha Chang would always say, like, the most important thing you're going to get out of this is, you know, not like craft stuff from class, not even like mentorship in the vertical way, but mentorship in the horizontal way. And I was like, yeah, whatever. But it's been incredibly true that if you come away with your, like I have 3 readers that I really trust that I came out of my MFA program with. And the fact that we can send each other work and we read each other well, we're generous with each other in terms of compliments, but also not afraid to be honest and critical. I think that's been so important, not just for the writing, but also just for like the mental health, right? And the emotional health of being a writer in a country that largely does not value writing and other art. So to have other people who, you know, you can just sort of talk to about work. Like, you know, two of my friends now, I'm not a part of this particular thing I'm going to describe, but they just have a simple thing they do at the end of a few days a week. Did you show up today? Meaning, did you show up at the desk, whatever the desk is? And there's no like, did you write 500 words? Did you write 6 pages? How much did you write? It's just, did you show up? And the fact that you can have someone who can check on you in that way and you can check on them that way reciprocally, I think is super important because it just makes you structure and prioritize your life differently. So I think that's super important because, you know, once you leave your MFA, it's like the world comes crashing back in, you know, and it can be challenging. So I really do think that, you know, of course, what you learn in the MFA is important and your teachers are important. I love teachers, but I really do think that, like, well, here's the thing, like once you leave, your teachers have to teach other people. You know, they can't be there for you in the same exact way forever. But you can be there for each other. And so, I'm sorry if that sounds hokey, but I used to think it was hokey, but I think it's totally true. I think it's totally true. Yeah.
Maybe one more question? The final question.
The final question. Hi.
Who do you admire most as a writer?
Which writers do I admire? Oh, well, I've already mentioned Toni Morrison. That was a huge, I mean, it was a devastating loss for tons of people. I was at a writing residency in Texas when I found out about that, and I was so isolated. I was in this house by myself. So it wasn't one of those residencies with a bunch of other people. It was just me in a desert town by myself. And so I was really affected. And I think, you know, I'll just talk about her for a minute. I mean, there are lots of other people, but she's tremendously important, not just for the quality of the work, which is, you know, breathtaking, but also for just, like, she's just the intellectual rigor, you know, like the stuff that she writes in terms of, you know, race in literature. Playing in the Dark is such an important book to me, and it's not fiction. The newest book that came out, The Source of Self-Regard, is really important to me, and it's essays and speeches. And the fact that she, you know, she really is an important reminder of something that I think in the conference that we went to, Tabby, like someone talked about this, but just like thinking about like essentially like who you're writing for. And you know, she has this thing where she's like Dostoevsky wasn't thinking about a little black girl from Ohio when he was writing. He was writing Russian literature, as he should have been, and she still connects with it. Right? She says Faulkner was arguably writing regional literature, right? But it's also universal because he's rooted, right? And so that not being afraid to be rooted in your community, right? I was talking to another writer the other day, and she said something I totally agree with. She said, you know, if I published a book and the literary world loved it and went crazy, but my family and my friends didn't read it or couldn't read it, I would be ashamed of myself. You know, so that kind of thing I think is super important. And I think Toni Morrison, one of the things that she reminds me of is that you write out of your base, you write out of your soil, and anything can flourish from your soil. You know, anything can grow from your soil. Like, don't try to write outside of it or presume that your soil isn't worthy. So she's someone I would mention. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.